welcome to episode 12 of Abbasid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamic history and a global medieval past. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihsc.org. I am your host, Hanne, a first-year PhD student at School of Origin and African Studies in London. And now on to the show. In the year 945 Common Era, Ali bin Buya, the son of a Caspian fisherman, got his brother Ahmed to make the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustakfi, based in Baghdad, after a siege to, quote, accept their services. And together with their brother Hassan, their family would dominate the Sunni caliphate for over a century. To discuss with me the remarkable rise and fall of this intriguing Shia Persian dynasty is the author of Putting the Caliph in His Place, Power and Authority in Medieval Islam, and currently an associate professor of history at Florida Atlantic University, Dr. Eric Hanne. Welcome, Dr. Hanne.
Thank you.
The Buyids were a provincial family, and their preeminence is as a result of dominating local rivals as well as the declining power of the central caliphal powers in Baghdad. Sketch for us the social-political scene in the Islamicate ecumene up to the point of Ahmed Buyid entering Baghdad in 945 Common Era.
Thank you. Thank you very much, by the way, Talha, for having me here. I'm honored to take part in this important series. Hope to provide not too bad a showing. Now, in answer to your question, I would like to state at the outset how, for listeners, that while my research on the manifestation of power and authority in the Central Islamic lands during the 10th, 12th century addresses the Buyids, my focus is on the Abbasids. So if the Abbasids show up a little bit more than people might think, bear with. That being said, in response to your request to provide a sketch of the socio-political scene leading to Ahmed ibn Buyid's arrival in 945, the key phrase that comes to mind is controlled chaos. The poor socio-political arena into which Ali Hassan and Ahmed ibn Buyid entered in the early to mid-10th century was the product of the disintegration of any semblance of Abbasid rule, a process that had begun in the first half of the 9th century. By the time we get to al-Mustakfi's reign, the quote-unquote reign, the Abbasid authority, while still in place, had been effectively stripped of any power. In the heterogeneous, porous socio-political arena of the Central Islamic lands of the mid-10th century, to establish oneself as an effective power, one first had to establish and then maintain an effective support base. That's it. As Joel Kramer so ably outlined in his work, Humanism in the Renaissance of Islam from 1986, the Buyids were just one of a number of Muluk al-Tawa'if in the Central Islamic lands when they arrived in the 10th century. Well, they were able to establish power bases in Fars, Rey, Isfahan, Jabal. The Hamdanis controlled Mosul, Diyarbakir, and regions around there. The Fatimids had control over Afriqiya and the Maghreb, and they eventually would take control over Egypt and parts of Syria from the Ikhshidids. The Samanids had effective power in Khorasan and points east, while other smaller potentates, the Ziyadids, Karmatians, Baridis, held control over their respective areas. There was no one hegemonic power within these Muslim lands. One would be tempted to state that the authority of the Abbasids was a glue that bound the Muslim world together. But as you and your listeners know, this authority was not necessarily recognized by all. Looking at you, Fatimids, and those that did acknowledge it often did so to build their legitimacy, meaning they acknowledged the authority for their own agendas. When we go beyond the simple discussion of power and authority, and then add in sectarian and ethnic labels, example, Zaydi, Ismaili, Ibn Ashari, Shi'i, Dailami, Persian, Kurd, Arab, then it gets really complicated.
The Buyids' so-called golden age is between 945 to 983 Common Era. How do the Buyids consolidate their powers after the conquest of Baghdad in 945 Common Era, and what are their developments?
Now, in terms of consolidating their position, My answer would be they would, but not easily. This trio of delimi condottieri, as they're often referred to, entered into the socio-political arena much like many others during this era, through working with others when it suited them, suited their purposes, and taking advantage of opportunities when they arose. Now, they've been closely associated with the Ziyadids and others in the decade before their quote-unquote conquest of Baghdad. Ali Hassan and Ahmad, to a degree, had gained much needed experience in dealing with myriad political and military players, most notably Mardavij ibn Ziyad. Now, upon Mardavij's death at the hands of his Turkish soldiery, please note that, Turkish soldiery, in 935, Hassan ibn Buya began his quest to establish control in Mardavij's former lands, most importantly, Isfahan. 935 was also the same year, by the way, when we have Al-Radi, the Caliph Al-Radi, conferring the title Amir al-Umara on Muhammad ibn Ra'iq, effectively cementing the Abbasids' handing over of military and administrative matters to military figures. Now, between 935 and 945, over that next decade, as Baghdad went through 10, count them 10 Amir al-Umara, the Buyids began to establish themselves, however tenuously, in the region. The Daylami infantry and Turkish cavalry were not loyal to a fault, and they had to keep an eye on their own military support. So in the end, Ahmed's quote-unquote taking of Baghdad in 945 was based not so much on his strong, forceful leadership, I would argue, but rather it was the collapse of Baradi control in Basra and revolts against the Samanas that left the Abbasid imperial city basically defenseless. And this is, by the way, not my own view per se. This is like the views of Donahue and Bussa and others. The Buyids' reliance on this familial confederacy, once Ahmad became the quote-unquote protector of the Abbasids, they relied, however, on this family confederacy to basically control their lands. The Buyids' reliance on this family confederacy was interesting, and this is something when you talk about it, like how they consolidated power, and they relied on a family confederacy with the eldest considered to be the supreme leader. When you think about that, that's not the best way to do things. That's not the best solution to establish any semblance of stable rule over one's lands. This method of relying on, well, the eldest among us should be the one we follow, just simply because he's the eldest, as it were, and we need to follow this as family loyalty. This method exacerbates the volatility and vulnerability that accompany household politics. Okay? Now, Donahue, in his work on the Buyids that came out in 2003 through Brill, Donahue points this out, and I want to quote him. The apparent contradiction is due to the two conflicting political concepts. And he's talking about how the Buyids had a problem. The Abbasid concept focusing on the caliph and his capital Baghdad, and the Buyid concept of rule by the elder. Only for a brief period were these two centers brought into line, and the subsequent failure to keep them aligned explains in part the Buwayhid, as he calls them the Buwayhids, Buwayhid collapse. This point is, I think, important to underscore. The fact is the Buyids' family confederacy method didn't mesh well with the fact that they came into their own when they became protectors of the caliph. But yet the caliphate is based in Baghdad, and in order to maintain that, you had to have a Buyid Amir in Baghdad, but at the same time, it's like Ahmad, who becomes Mu'izz al-Dawla. He's the junior member of the Buyid Brotherhood, okay? It's Imad al-Dawla. It's his brother Ali, who becomes Imad al-Dawla, who's revered. And this kind of system can only work for, at best, a generation before cracks begin to show. And in the case of the Buyids, I would argue it didn't even last more than a decade.
Wow. The epitome of the Buyid dynasty comes with the reign of al-Dawla in Iraq from 978 to 983 Common Era. Tell us about al-Dawla and developments after his death.
Now, al-Dawla is a fascinating figure in his own right. You've got Ahmed, otherwise known as Mu'izz al-Dawla, who's associated with the Abbasids in Baghdad. And you've got Imad al-Dawla, the eldest of the brothers, who's viewed as a supreme leader. Imad al-Dawla dies, if I'm correct, 949. Yeah, Imad al-Dawla dies in 949, just 4 years after Mu'izz al-Dawla is established in Baghdad. But the thing is, Imad al-Dawla didn't have any issue. He appointed his nephew, Rukn al-Dawla's son, Hassan, who becomes Rukn al-Dawla in 945. Rukn al-Dawla's son, Abu Shuja' al-Khusraw, as his heir. So he appoints his nephew as his heir. That heir is al-Dawla. So that's interesting in its own right, just the household politics involved. This is not to, detract from al-Dawla, however. I mean, just simply he's the nephew and the household politics weakens him. It isn't. al-Dawla is a fascinating figure, and it is his reign, brief as it is often seen as the apogee of the Buyid era. Yes, part of that view that his reign is the apogee of the Buyids, in my mind, it's due to what I call, and you're going to have to bear with me here, what I call the Harun al-Rashid effect. And by that, I'm saying, go back, for all you Abbasid historians out there, go back. What occurs after Harun al-Rashid's reign? What occurs after Harun al-Rashid's reign is so heinous,
right,
for the Abbasids, that his reign is often viewed as, rightly or wrongly, as the height of the first half of the Abbasid dynasty.
Right.
Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, mind you. Okay, but I'm saying generally people go, "Oh yes, Harun al-Rashid was brilliant." Well, not so much. He wasn't a dynamic figure. So that's what I'm saying is a lot of credit is given to al-Dawla for this reason, because what occurs after al-Dawla's death in 983 is basically this trajectory, this gradual trajectory downward for the Buyids. That being said, because think about it, al-Dawla dies in 983. The Buyid familial confederacy bears its, what I call the volatile fruits, of household politics, and evolved into a generation of destructive infighting among the family members and factions within the Buyid military forces. These conflicts, in turn, provided opportunities for other polities, the Uqaylids, Fatimids, Samanids, Ghaznavids, and of course the Abbasids, to fill the power vacuums. So, what occurs after al-Dawla's death is pretty heinous as well for the Buyids. That being said, I don't want you to leave you with the impression that al-Dawla was a failure. He was not. Unlike Harun al-Rashid, who I had mentioned earlier, al-Dawla was a capable figure, a willful figure, both militarily and politically. And here I've got to give credit to people like Christine Baker. She effectively argues in a chapter that she did for Routledge. The title of this chapter is The Lost Origins of the Daylamites and the Construction of a New Ethnic Legacy for the Buyids. And this is just a really wonderful chapter. al-Dawla rewrites the ethnic legacy of the Daylamites, blending Persian, Arab, and Muslim markers of cultural identity. And he does so in order to more effectively claim authority to rule over an increasingly heterogeneous population of Muslims. As she points out, in addition to being a consummate military tactician, al-Dawla knew what he was up against in terms of winning over the established political and ideological elites, to his cause. In other words, he needed to bring in the indigenous populations over this region, and so he had to create this. He was recognized by the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ta'i as chief emir. That was wonderful, but that would not be sufficient in light of the Buyids' non-existent pedigree for all intents and purposes in the eyes of the region's political and military and ideological elite. His identity and that of the Buyids would have to be created, she argues, to include Daylamite, Persian, Arab, Muslim, and actually a little dash of Zoroastrianism thrown in there. And this is fascinating in many ways. It's great because Christine Baker's work builds upon what Donahue was talking about, and of course theirs worked upon the works of I think they really kind of build upon and go beyond what Hanne and Bussa talked about with the Buyids generations ago. But Christine Baker's work builds upon that statement regarding the need for the Buyids to effectively blend both the Abbasid Baghdad political concept and the Buyid familial confederacy political concept. They needed to blend that. And that's what al-Dawla did during his brief reign. It was so necessary. Unfortunately for the Buyids, he was just one man. He could not do what was essential, and that was to build the institutions that needed to be built, okay, that would be able to foster that beyond his reign. So yes, he had a brief and successful reign, but basically his efforts would fall victim to the centrifugal forces of family infighting and regional predators after his death. I mean, 983 beyond to me is just like the demise. I mean, Herbert Bussa in his book, Caliph and Großkönig, basically breaks it down as such. Like post 983, forget about the Buyids. They're going down. It takes a while, but they're going down.
If the Buyid era can be described as the Shia century, then with the installment of al-Qadir Billah in 991 Common Era as a caliphate, they thought they could control better, and then we see ironically the start of what is dubbed the Sunni revival. You cover this in your book. Tell us how the Persian Shia Buyids cede to the Turkish Sunni Seljuks, who would go on to dominate governance in the Islamicate ecumene.
Okay, this is one of those things where I'm going to sound like a bit of a politician in coming back to you. I mean, there are problems in the scholarship to refer to this as the Shia century, and historians and scholars really kind of like, they're pushing back against that. They're basically saying to Madelung and Bussa is like Cahen to a degree, even it's like you didn't necessarily get it right, because as you look into it, and here I'm all credit due to other scholars, not myself, who've looked into these issues. This isn't the Shia century. It shouldn't be called as such. And in fact, that label, Shia, it speaks to this concept of Sunni Shia, this whole sectarian divide, this binary concept, which my own research into the Abbasids basically says that's a red herring. That's a misnomer. It doesn't exist. And then, of course, when we talk about the Sunni revival, it's like, what are we talking about? What do you mean by that? And it really isn't defined. Yes, Makdisi had his article on it, and that's interesting, but most people have effectively fought back against that. And so to answer your question, that's my very long preface to answer your question. Tell us how the Persian Shia Buyids see to the Turkish Sunni Seljuks. My thing is, I would basically say the Buyids see to the Seljuks because of what I discussed earlier. They had lost their ability to maintain control of their territories. They had basically were more focused on infighting, the infighting between, say, Jalal al-Dawla, the son of Baha ad-Dawla, and his nephew Abu Khalija. I mean, Baha ad-Dawla. Well, let me go back a bit. You bring up al-Qadr, so it's a good opportunity. Let's look to why al-Qadr was chosen to begin with. Okay, al-Qadr was chosen because Baha ad-Dawla in 991 needed to prove himself to his relatives, Samsam ad-Dawla and Fakhr ad-Dawla, and it didn't work. I'm currently working on an article, Sikha Denied, in which al-Qadr is not recognized in the East by Fakhr ad-Dawla, etc., in the coinage and in the khutbah. I mean, they basically tell Baha ad-Dawla to go pound sand. They're not going to accept him and his choice of al-Qadr. So the choice of Baha ad-Dawla to remove al-Ta'i as Abbasid caliph, replace him with al-Qadr, was a purely political move premised on household politics on the part of Baha'u'llah, and it had nothing to do with anything sectarian or otherwise. It was purely political and to follow his own agenda. And I would argue it was relatively a failure in the sense that when he had appointed al-Qadr, he made al-Qadr and he thought, okay, now I've got my own caliph in my back pocket. Al-Qadr basically, he said, no. Al-Qadr, all these officials that Baha'u'llah appointed to, staff his administration, they were replaced almost immediately. Al-Qadr didn't have any power in the true sense of the word. He might have quote unquote authority, but he didn't have any power. So he had to play it very safe during the first part of his reign. But Al-Qadr gradually, he fills the void that Baha'u'llah is leaving, because Baha'u'llah is dealing with trying to run his territories. They're trying to deal with his recalcitrant family members, and this gives Al-Qadr an opportunity to assert himself more fully. Again, nothing to do with sectarian issues. It has all to do with simply raw politics at this point. And so the Buyids as a whole, they got more than they bargained for after Baha'u'llah appointed Al-Qadr, because the last thing they needed was, on top of all of their internal fighting, they did not need a revitalized caliph, in the sense that a caliph who is not necessarily militarily capable, but is able to assert himself into the household politics of the Buyids. That they did not want that. And this just simply exacerbated an already problematic situation for the Buyids. I mean, you have the troops coming to Al-Qadr asking for him to support Jalal al-Dawla, for example, or Abu Khalijar after, this is after Baha'u'llah's death. And the caliph becomes a bit of a kingmaker in a sense. This is not what the Buyids needed. You've got then, of course, the rise, Al-Qadra's reign, that is, you get the rise of Mahmud of Ghazni, who was definitely a key military figure from the East. And he's asserting himself into the situation to a degree. So you've got the situation becoming more tenuous for the Buyids. And when eventually, if we go into later generations of the Buyids, when the Seljuks arrive on the scene, the Buyids were pretty much out of the picture already. And so I don't even know if it's a matter of seeding as much as they were already prostrate, and they didn't have any, they could not put up, they were basically out of the picture. It was really a vacuum, I would argue, that the Seljuks filled. Not so much removing the Buyids, because the Buyids, I would argue, removed themselves by this point. It was really the Seljuks filling in a vacuum that was left. That was basically, at this point, this vacuum still had the Abbasids, still had a couple other players, of course, and interestingly enough, then we have the Fatimids trying to fill that vacuum to a degree, and this is when we get into the loveliness that is Abbasid and all that other weirdness that's going on. This is a reason, by the way, just for your listeners, this is a reason why most people don't study this period. It's just too damn complex. There are too many moving parts going on right now. This is not to so I'm sorry, that's a very long-winded, roundabout way of not answering your question. But I cannot talk about this based upon sectarian issues or even ethnic issues at this point, because there are too many ethnicities involved here. And the sectarian issue is a non-starter. I mean, look at just further proof for people. What is Al-Qadr's successor's name? Al-Qaim. Al-Qaim is a name that evokes all sorts of interesting ideas and concepts and symbols. Al-Qaim. That's an alid symbolism involved in that. When Al-Qadr was chosen, he talks about a dream he had where he meets Ali. You get these accounts in which there's a blending going on, and this is the issue. Yeah, we have riots amongst the Shia and Sunni quarters, quote unquote quarters in Baghdad. You get riots in all cities. and they will put a veneer of sectarianism on it. But the reality is, it's all about the almighty dinar and dirham and any other issue, but not necessarily sectarian issues. I would argue that if anything, possibly ethnic disputes might be more of an issue. And that's basically like the difference between infantry and armor, infantry and cavalry. That, I mean, between the Buyids, the Daylamis, and the Seljuks, okay, and the Turks, who are cavalry or something. That has more of a play in these things than, say, sectarian disputes.
The Buyid era would witness the canonization of Twelver Shi'ism as we know it today, with the lives of scholars like al-Kulaini, who died around 940 Common Era, and Sheikh al-Mufid, who dies in 1022 Common Era. So tell us about the lasting legacy of the Buyids, not just in matters in faith and sectarian, but also in the arts and cultural production.
My discussion has generally been very down on the Buyids, and I really shouldn't be so down. I mean, they did have a lasting effect. As I often talk about, one thing which I find fascinating is, this is just one minor thing, but it becomes a major thing. It's the commemoration of the Ashura festival, the commemoration of the martyrdom of Hussein in 680 in Karbala. By most accounts, from what I've read, I mean, during the first generation, the Buyids brought in, al-Dawla brought in a very Daylami tradition of lamentation during the Ashura commemoration. What we now see today in the world, I mean, this is, if you want to say, this is a legacy of the Buyids. I mean, they brought in a very traditional, I wouldn't say it's an ethnic thing, but it's a traditional thing from Daylami culture, from the Southern Caspian culture. But in a larger sense, I think the lasting legacy of the Buyids is they incorporated a militarization of the territories. And I don't mean in some Spartan sense. I'm talking about the fact is their expansion and development of the Iqta system and associating much more with the soldiery, the infantry and the cavalry, for example, as opposed to the established aristocracy and the wealthy merchants, etc. The point is, I would argue that that is a legacy that would be built upon by later. So this militarization of the aristocracy, I think, would be a legacy. And of course, their patronage of all these brilliant scholars, Ferdowsi and others, that all these scholars, these brilliant scholars, and this is all outlined in Kramer's book on humanism and the Renaissance of Islam, it's like this was a period in which so much tremendous work was being done. And that is a legacy that cannot be ignored.
You alluded to this earlier. The sources for the Buyid period can often be confusing with the minutiae of seemingly insignificant skirmishes recorded, and also by the over-documentation in metropolitan centres despite their regional powers being more significant. Tell us about the primary and secondary sources for the Buyid dynasty, and where would you recommend interested listeners go to next if they want to learn more about this fascinating family?
For my own research, what was essential, and this is going to come across as a bit of a shock, was I started, my starting point was Ibn al-Jawzi. Okay? Ibn al-Jawzi, and from there I went on to al-Rudhawari and Nitzkuwethi, as just basically focusing on the chroniclers. But then you've got, of course, Abu Ishaq al-Sabbi, is, the extracts we have from Kitab al-Taji. And you've got, of course, Hilal al-Sabbi, it was Rusum Dar al-Khilafa. Those are the initial major primary sources that I worked upon. But there are, of course, others that one should incorporate. But for sake of time, I'll just leave it at that. But in terms of secondary literature, I mean, work on your German, Caliph and Großkönig. Go with Bussa. He's got a couple of articles in English, chapters in English, but it's Caliph and Großkönig is a good place to start. But that was in the late 60s, and there really hasn't been a lot done. And that was so frustrating. There's very, very few. But 2003, we get John Donohue's work, his work on the Buyids, it only covers up to the end of the reign of al-Dawla, and so it stops in 1012, which is problematic, but it's overall it's a decent work. It's very helpful. He's talking about the building of the institutions on the part of the Buyids, and it's fascinating in its own right. But then you've got again work by Christine Baker on that chapter, but her dissertation was comparing the Buyids and the Fatimids, and she very much influenced my thinking on the issues of, sectarianism isn't really all what it's all cracked up to be. The same holds true for, say, the work of Stephanie Mulder and her work on the Alid shrines in Syria. I mean, it's from a later period, but she too is also basically, sectarianism, schmectarianism, people. You need to get beyond that. You need to get beyond that binary black and white scenario, because the evidence isn't there to back it up. I mean, her work on the Alid shrines is fascinating because, I mean, these were patronized, built, and utilized by both Sunni and Shia. And just don't even get me started on the development of those two groups, because, come on. I mean, we can't even talk about Sunni in the 10th century in my book. You really can't really effectively talk about Sunni, or for that matter, Shia. You can begin to see these things. I mean, they're formulating, but these are all ex post facto creations. I mean, this is from centuries later. People going back and this is what it was. Like, well, that's great, but at the time, it was a much more heterogeneous, cosmopolitan, non-sectarian issue. That doesn't mean people got along. Lord knows, you can see it. People didn't get along. But they weren't divided. They didn't identify. Okay, I'm Shia, I'm Sunni. It doesn't work that way.
Questions from listeners. First from Abdurrahman Azam at the other Exile on Twitter, a scion of an important recent dynasty himself and author of a biography on Saladin. My question would be, firstly, thank you for your excellent research, which greatly helped me in my writing of Saladin. My question is, how do you view the term the Sunni revival?
I kind of think I just answered that. I don't really call it that. I would argue that the development, say, of the madrasas associated with, say, Nizam al-Mulk, okay, this is something that was already kind of done by the Buyids to a lesser extent. I mean, they patronized scholars and work. And this is basically what Nizam al-Mulk was doing. And he didn't, I would be hard pressed to say he referred to himself as Sunni. They referred to themselves, and this is what you, Taha, will appreciate, is they referred to themselves basically more along the lines of the madhabs by their own views. I mean, I'll use for an example, Al-Qadr, the Itiqad al-Qadri, the Qadri creed, okay, where basically he puts this out, he sponsored this, and this is mind-blowing when you think about it. So Al-Qadr puts out this creed of belief. This is what we as Muslims, are going to believe. Have you ever studied that? If you look into it, it's basically a Hanbali creed, okay? It's ripping apart the Mu'tazila, okay? It's attacking that. I mean, it's basically saying, I, the caliph, am putting my imprimatur on this creed of belief. And that's fascinating in its own right. The fact that a few generations before, when, as we all hear about, when Ma'mun tried to establish some sort of, caliphal orthodoxy, scholars basically told him to go talk to the hand. A few generations later, the scholars are like, hey, we need this. We're going to promote the authority of the caliph. That has a lot more to tied in, I would argue, with this quote unquote Sunni revival than anything else. Is who's patronizing the scholars? The Buyids patronized many of the what would later be referred to as Shia scholars, but they patronized everyone, and the Seljuks would do the same. But to call it a Sunni Shia or Sunni revival, it's like, I don't think the Sunnis existed to be revived in an established sense. They were just always there.
And a thought from Dr. Sean Anthony at Sasanian Shah on Twitter. He's skeptical about the qualifiers for Persian and Shia for the Buyids. How do you respond?
I've already kind of mentioned it. I don't. I mean, think about it. I mean, where the Buyids came from? They came from the southwestern Caspian region, in this mountainous region, Delam. It didn't receive Islam until much later. I mean, we can go into the idea of those people living in the more hilly mountainous areas and cultural ideas and cultural penetration, etc., and all those fun things. First of all, the populace of this region didn't accept Islam until much later. And then when they did accept Islam, when you get Zaydis involving themselves, and then Ismailis were involving themselves in this region. So in terms of sectarian issues, I'd be hard pressed to refer to the Daylamis as necessarily quote unquote Shia. They had proclivities, but they were much more focused on establishing themselves on the ground. And in order to do that in this rough and tumble world, you have to work with multiple groups, multiple individuals and polities and quote unquote sects. So you cannot be ideologically pristine by that sense. And so that's where it's problematic in my case. And when it comes to the Persian aspect, I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, this is where, again, you've got a lot of work. And again, go back to Christine Baker's work. It's a bit tricky. I mean, to refer to the Daylamites as Persian is problematic. If you look back and you look at Zoroastrian texts and other texts, I mean, they're not in the right climate to be Persian. Okay, they're in the wrong climate. They're from the cold climate. They're not associated with the Persians or the Medes. And so again, it's the problem of labels. And so we have to deal with that, unfortunately. But I agree with Sean Anthony and Khuldadad Reza Khani's questioning the Shia and Persian labels. I think that they are spot on with that, and other scholars are spot on with that. That being said, when we talk about these things, we have to acknowledge them and then kind of clarify these issues.
And finally, a question from Syed at gypsy_heart6 on Twitter. Can you guys expand on the note from Ibn al-Faqih? I'm assuming that's the geographer. What was the nature of segregation / interaction between different sects of Islam in 10th century Baghdad? Did the caliphs have reasons to fear dominance of certain communities and try to manage it? How much of Baghdad and Greater Iraq could possibly be Muslim in the 10th century?
I don't have any statistics about the 10th century Baghdad's Muslim population. I mean, but by then, I mean, in general, the majority of the population in the region is Muslim by the 10th century, I would argue. Okay, before then, no, not necessarily. But by the 10th century, I would say yes. But again, I don't have any hard patch numbers there. As opposed to quote unquote segregation of the sects or whatever, as I've talked about, it's like, again, it's much more cosmopolitan than people want to give it. They want to delineate people. They want to put labels around people and walls around people. It just didn't exist. People, yeah, they lived in the specific quarters, and that's more of a neighborhood squabble than it is a sectarian device. And when you think about it and you ponder it, it makes sense, because the formation of what would become considered classical Shia thought or classical quote unquote Sunni thought, that's not even in existence at this point. I mean, we've got to get beyond this idea that as of 632, you have the Sunnis and the Shia. It didn't happen that way, as we all know. And yet people, for some reason, fixate on it, that this is a Sunni-Shia split as of 632 with the death of the Prophet. Like, dudes, it didn't work that way. And it took a few centuries. First of all, for the population to become Muslim, and secondly, for quote-unquote sectarian issues to arise.
You're the author of Putting the Caliph in His Place, Power and Authority in Medieval Islam. and currently researching the Buyid Dynasty. Final words for our listeners?
Just keep reading. Learn more languages. Now, the Buyids, and this is my plug. The Buyids are fascinating because I did putting the caliph in his place because I wanted to understand the manifestation of power and authority in the medieval Islamic world. And in so doing, I realized that we as scholars, we as historians need to focus a lot more on power relationships and differentiate that between authority. I mean, the idea that power is your ability to force, it's the ability to have people do what you want them to do, as it were. Authority is the right to do so. And that was fascinating in my own way. And it was fascinating to use that to study the Abbasids, the post 945 Abbasids, at least up to the Caliph al-Nasir. And it opened my eyes to what's out there. But then, in so doing, I got introduced to the Buyids, who are a fascinating group, which we don't have time to get into today. But they're around from the rise of the Buyids up until the decline of the Seljuks. They exist. They're a player on this field, in this arena. And they're working with the Fatimids, the Buyids, the Seljuks, the Abbasids, the Uqaylids, the Crusaders, etc. They're working with anyone who's going to have them. And that's what makes it fascinating. And they survive. Yes, they're a quote-unquote Shiite Arab dynasty based in southern Iraq. What the heck's that supposed to mean? I mean, when you look at it, it's just like, come on. But then that's what just gets us into the fascinating issue of the historiography of this field. Because the biases of the chroniclers is just, it's so clear when they're talking about the Buyids, because the Buyids confound them. They can't understand. It's like, wait a minute, these people don't fit into our nice, neat categories. And I'm going, hello, wake up, smell the coffee. Humans don't fit into your categories. Stop trying to categorize people as Sunni or Shia or Arab or Turk or Arab or whatever. It's not that simple. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm waffling on too much.
No, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you, Dr. Hanne. Thank you for being our guest.